Some of you know me from the Continuum blog, and some of you know me from over 20 years as a contributing editor, writing quite a bit over the years for Touchstone magazine, etc. In the last year, I've written two things that I put on the Continuum blog that have received exactly the kind of reaction that I did in fact anticipate. And in both of these, one, back in the summer, I believe, and then the other one just last week, both of these pieces, I very clearly laid out my pro-life beliefs. My belief that the sin of abortion is very great, and that one of those articles, tying it into the fact that there's a complete abandonment of sexual morality as we know and understand from God's commandment. In the same two articles, I also said that it is terribly wrong for Christians to be very open to supporting the mistreatment of refugees and asylum seekers at the border and defending the splitting up of parents from their children. And yeah, I could predict, and I did expect and anticipate, that despite the clear traditional beliefs of what I said about the sin of abortion and the value of every human life, every child in the womb, I knew that if I also mentioned asylum seekers and refugees, and also said something on behalf of the poor and destitute in the United States, that I would in fact be labeled by some people as a left-wing propagandist. And I, in both cases, asked, would someone please explain why a left-wing propagandist would be so pro-life and so traditional in all of his moral beliefs? Which has stumped some people. I'm presenting this today this way and calling it false choices, because it's important that we understand the only source from which we as Christians are to derive our moral beliefs and understanding. The affirmation of St. Louis tells us that our consciences are to be formed by the Word of God. There is, in the United States, such political division right now that it is, I think, almost unprecedented in modern times. I think if you go back to the presidency of John Adams, you'll find that between him and the followers of Thomas Jefferson supporting one or the other for president, you'll see a lot of bitterness and contention. Certainly if you go back to the 1860s when the country split in two and you had this, what's called the Civil War. Well, right now I'm thinking people are about ready to come to blows and fight each other. It's quite obvious that every single ethical, moral issue that could in any way spill over into economics or politics has to be placed in one camp or the other. If you care about the child in the womb who is subject to being dismembered cruelly and put to death unjustly, then you automatically are supposed to fit into one camp. If you care about the stranger and the refugee and the poor, then you have to be in the other camp. And the two camps have to be at war with each other. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. But those who insist on a false choice, you have to be in one camp or the other, are gaining a certain amount of their moral understanding from political parties and ideologies. You need to be free of that. I am free of that. It is a matter of fact, I understand that the role of the prophets in the Old Testament was not to congratulate even a very good king when he did wrong. So that even kings such as Asa and Jehoshaphat were at times rebuked by the prophets. Of course, the most famous King David was rebuked by Nathan the prophet. God's spokesmen are not to take sides on political issues when it comes to these moral matters. And yeah, moral matters do indeed spill over into political issues, and there's no avoiding it. Now, we are living in a time when the United States is facing, as it has in other eras, a big influx of immigration. I do not claim to know the answers to every one of those questions and problems. Obviously, when thousands of people suddenly show up at the border, a lot of them, just by pure statistics, whenever you have thousands of people anywhere, there's going to be some bad people, probably a lot. But that's just the way it is if you walk around my neighborhood. The statistics are that some of these are not going to be very nice people. And if you walk around my town, Chapel Hill, no doubt you will find drug dealers and other kinds of people. But the fact of the matter is, we don't label everybody in any of these groups as all being bad because of the few that are. My concern that I have been voicing is that many of you, my dear fellow Anglicans and even Anglican clergy, are not expressing any kind of disapproval of policies when they're too brutal and too harsh on the asylum seekers. You should be just as concerned about that as you are about any other group of people facing an injustice, whether it's persecuted Christians, whether it's innocent children in the womb. Yes, there are some people that must not be allowed into this country. That doesn't mean that desperate asylum seekers should be locked in prisons and have their children taken away. Whatever you think should be the policy, if you are representing Christ, it must begin with compassion and justice, not with political talking points from a party, not with a denial that the problem exists. The problem exists, whether you want to believe it or not. Regarding the poor, I have had some of you react against what I've said about helping the poor with libertarian talking points. It's their own fault. There's nothing you can do about it. Don't give them anything. Don't help them. I spent 15 years as a legal medical investigator in mostly Baltimore. I'm an expert on the policies and laws that have to do with medical care for the poor. And I'm going to tell you right now that in most cases the law isn't going to help them much. There's a law that the poor who go into a hospital emergency room must be stabilized before they're released. Let me explain how this works in real life. One of our clients, where I used to represent the poor who had been hospitalized, was a woman who was 23 years old. Oh, this is back in the 1990s. But the law hasn't changed. The same thing would happen today. This woman had kidney disease and needed dialysis. She had no coverage. She had no insurance. She did not have Medicaid. She didn't have anything. And what she had to do was wait until the situation became an emergency. Go to the emergency room, get stabilized. This was her method for staying alive until she could find a way to pay for dialysis as a regular treatment. I had her case and worked on it. And one day, she didn't get to the emergency room on time and died at the age of 23. And yeah, I am going to say right now, there's not another democratic, developed nation anywhere on earth where that would happen, only the United States. So you can tell me that trying to provide health care for everyone, including the poor, is somehow impossible. Or you can think a little more deeply. Because I'm telling you right now, if they can do it everywhere else, they can do it here. And whether or not you think I have the answers or not you think you have the answers, again, it should all start from the concept of compassion. It should all start from a heart of compassion. And followers of Christ must not just fall in line with some ideology. And it's not left-wing ideology to say we can do and should do better for the poor. No, the church cannot take the place of the social programs. It would cripple us financially. Anyone who suggests that instead of that being done by government programs, it should be done by the church is really saying that it should not be done at all. I'm basing all this on the parable that we call the parable of the sheep and the goats. You know it. Matthew 25, beginning at verse 31 to verse 46. The only caveat I will give is that most of your English translations render aeonius as eternal, which I believe is not a correct translation. Other than that, the issue is the final judgment. It's not going to be a final exam. All your theology may be very right and very good. You might even be in the one true church, if there is such a thing, which there isn't. But I'm going to say right now, the final judgment is not going to be a final exam. You might have all the answers right. But Jesus is going to look at you, and the criteria is, how did you treat him? And how did you treat him? Meaning, how did you treat those who are hungry, thirsty, naked, strangers, a lot in the Bible about that, sick, in prison? How did you treat him and those people? How did you treat him in one of the least of these? We can have disagreements about policies, but what we can't have a disagreement about is love and the justice that comes from love. And that if you don't love your brother who you have seen, you cannot love God whom you've not seen. That's not left-wing politics. Just as being pro-life and opposing the sin and evil of abortion is not right-wing politics. Just as upholding traditional marriage is not right-wing politics. None of it's politics. It is a question of Are you forming your consciences according to the Word of God, or according to the pundits on TV and the politicians? It is that simple.